A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, for years we have talked about the shadow war in the Middle East as this localized, almost self-contained chess match between Jerusalem and Tehran. But the news coming out this week about coordinated NATO sorties over Iranian airspace has completely shattered that illusion. It feels like we are watching the formal end of regional isolation. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the history of NATO, its origins, and specifically how Israel's strategic view of the alliance has evolved in light of these recent military operations.
I am Herman Poppleberry, and honestly, what we are seeing right now is the most significant shift in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's operational reality since the fall of the Berlin Wall. For decades, the mantra was that NATO is a defensive alliance focused on the North Atlantic and Europe. But those sorties over Iran, where we saw NATO Airborne Warning and Control Systems, or AWACS, providing the target data for Israeli and Allied strike packages, that represents a fundamental breach of the traditional out-of-area limitations. It is no longer just about defending Brussels or London, it is about the projection of stability into the heart of the most volatile region on Earth.
It is a massive pivot, and I think to understand why this is happening now, we have to look back at how we got here. Most people think of NATO as this static entity that just exists to keep the peace in Europe, but the origins tell a different story. It was founded in 1949 primarily to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. The core of it, Article 5, says an attack against one is an attack against all. But Israel is not a member of NATO. It has never had Article 5 protection. So, how did we get to a point where NATO assets are flying cover for missions over Iran?
The evolution is fascinating because it started with very tentative diplomatic steps. In the mid-90s, NATO launched the Mediterranean Dialogue. It was a way to engage with non-member countries like Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. It was mostly talk at first, sharing information on disaster relief or maritime security. Then, in 2004, they added the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which was aimed specifically at the Gulf states. For a long time, the Israeli strategic view was that NATO was a useful diplomatic forum, but a military non-factor when the chips were down. They saw NATO as bureaucratic and risk-averse. But that changed when the technology started to outpace the diplomacy.
You are talking about the plumbing, right? The technical integration that happened long before the political permission was granted. I remember we touched on this a bit when we discussed the Secret Air Defense Alliance. There is a world of difference between a diplomat signing a memorandum of understanding and a technician installing a Link 16 data link on an Israeli fighter jet.
That is where the real story lies. Link 16 is the gold standard for NATO communication. It is a tactical data link network that allows aircraft, ships, and ground forces to exchange their tactical picture in near real time. For a long time, Israel used its own proprietary systems, which were excellent, but they did not talk to the NATO systems. Over the last decade, there has been a quiet, relentless push to achieve what they call interoperability. The goal was to make sure that an Israeli F-35, which they call the Adir, could see exactly what a NATO E-3 Sentry was seeing without having to say a word over the radio.
And that is what we saw during the recent sorties. We are talking about a scenario where the sensor and the shooter are separated by thousands of miles and different national flags, but they are functioning as a single nervous system. I think we need to address a major misconception here. A lot of people see these headlines and assume Israel is basically a member of NATO now. But that is not true, and quite frankly, I do not think Israel even wants that.
The Israeli defense establishment has always been wary of formal alliances that might restrict their freedom of maneuver. If you are an Article 5 member, you have obligations. You might be dragged into a conflict in the Baltics that does not serve your immediate national interest. Israel's strategy has always been about self-reliance. They want the tools and the data from NATO, but they do not want the handcuffs of a formal treaty. What we are seeing now is what I call a network-based alliance rather than a treaty-based one. It is a coalition of the willing that is held together by shared data protocols and a common enemy in the Iranian regime.
It is a very pragmatic approach to foreign policy, honestly. It is transactional and functional. It is not about grand idealistic visions of global governance. It is about who has the best radar data and who is willing to use it to stop a ballistic missile threat. If you look at the recent actions, it seems the NATO command structure has realized that the defense of Europe actually begins in the Middle East. If Iran achieves a nuclear breakout or continues to dominate the regional corridors, the security of the Mediterranean is gone.
The strategic geography has shifted. In 1949, the threat was tank divisions rolling through the Fulda Gap in Germany. In 2026, the threat is a swarm of low-cost drones and medium-range missiles launched from the Iranian plateau. The NATO Integrated Air and Missile Defense Architecture, or IAMD, was originally designed to protect European cities from Russian strikes. But as we saw during the Caspian Shield operations earlier this month, which we discussed in episode 1133, that same architecture is now being used to create a digital canopy over the entire region. When those Israeli jets struck targets in Iran recently, they were using NATO standardized data links to avoid Iranian air defenses that had been tipped off by Russian intelligence.
Let us talk about that Caspian Shield context for a second, because that was a turning point. That strike on the Nakhchivan enclave in March of this year was the first time we saw the live-fire integration of the Israel-Azerbaijan NATO data sharing protocol. It was a proof of concept. It showed that you could have a non-NATO state, Israel, operating in a complex environment with the support of NATO standard assets. It proved that the plumbing worked. The recent sorties over Iran are just the scaling up of that success.
The mechanics of these recent sorties are wild when you dig into the details. We are talking about NATO AWACS flying in international airspace or over friendly territory, acting as the eyes for strike packages that include Israeli, American, and even some British and French assets. The AWACS can see deep into Iranian territory, tracking their mobile surface-to-air missile batteries and their interceptor launches. They feed that data directly into the cockpits of the strike aircraft. The Iranian radar operators might not even see the F-35 because of its stealth characteristics, but the F-35 pilot knows exactly where the threat is because the NATO bird is whispering in his ear.
It also solves the refueling problem, which has always been the Achilles heel of any potential Israeli strike on Iran. By coordinating with NATO, the logistical tail becomes much more robust. You have a network of tankers and support aircraft that can keep those strike packages in the air far longer than Israel could do on its own. It effectively negates the distance between Tel Aviv and Tehran. But there is a massive second-order effect here that I think we need to explore. How do Russia and China react to this? Because if NATO is now an active participant in Middle Eastern offensive operations, the global security map has just been redrawn.
Russia is in a very difficult position. They have spent years trying to position themselves as the power broker in the Middle East, balancing their relationship with Israel while supporting the Assad regime and partnering with Iran. But this level of NATO-Israel integration makes their S-400 missile systems look increasingly obsolete. If the NATO-Israeli network can jam or bypass the best Russian tech, then Russia's leverage in the region evaporates. China is watching this even more closely. They see the Middle East as a key node in their Belt and Road initiative. If the United States and NATO can project this kind of integrated power, it suggests that the West is not as retreated or as fragmented as Beijing's propaganda likes to claim.
It is a projection of strength that goes beyond just military hardware. It is a demonstration of institutional agility. People have been calling NATO brain dead for years, but this shows a level of coordination that is frankly terrifying if you are sitting in a bunker in Tehran. But I want to push back on the offensive part for a second. NATO always frames these things as defensive. They will say these sorties were part of a preemptive defense to prevent an imminent attack on Allied interests. Is that just a semantic game, or is there a genuine shift in how they define defense?
It is a bit of both. There was a huge debate back in the 1999 Washington Summit about out-of-area operations. The question was whether NATO could act outside of its member states' borders. They eventually decided they could if there was a threat to the security of the members. Fast forward to today, and the definition of a threat has expanded. If Iran is supplying drones to Russia for use in Ukraine, which they have been doing for years, then an Iranian military asset is a direct threat to the European theater. By hitting the source in Iran, NATO can argue they are defending the soil of Poland or Germany. It is an aggressive interpretation of collective security, but in a networked world, it is the only one that makes sense.
It also brings up the issue of pre-approved spontaneity. This is something we talked about in episode 696. With AI-driven threat detection, the window for decision-making has shrunk to seconds. If a NATO sensor detects a missile launch sequence in Iran, the system might automatically authorize a counterstrike or a jamming operation based on preset rules of engagement. This takes the human politician out of the loop in the heat of the moment. It means that the military integration is so deep that the political consequences are almost baked in before a single shot is fired.
That creates a use it or lose it scenario for regional commanders. If you have the data and the capability to neutralize a threat before it launches, and your systems are telling you the window is closing, you are going to take the shot. This is why the Israeli strategic view of NATO has changed from one of skepticism to one of essential partnership. They realize that they cannot win the information war alone. They need the massive sensor grid that only an organization like NATO can provide.
What about the Abraham Accords? Does this military integration make those political deals less important? If you have this high-level security architecture, do you even need the formal diplomatic handshakes with countries like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia?
I would argue it makes them more essential. The Abraham Accords provided the political cover for this military integration to happen. You cannot have NATO AWACS flying over the region or Israeli jets crossing certain airspaces without the quiet consent of the regional players. The military reality preceded the political signatures in many ways, but the signatures are what allow the infrastructure to be built. We are seeing the emergence of a Middle Eastern version of NATO, but it is not a formal organization with a headquarters and a flag. It is a series of overlapping bilateral and multilateral agreements that all plug into the same NATO standardized technical backbone.
It is like a modular alliance. You can plug in different countries depending on the mission. Today, it is Israel and NATO hitting Iran. Tomorrow, it might be Saudi Arabia and the United States tracking maritime threats in the Red Sea. The common thread is the technology and the standards. If you speak Link 16 and you have the right encryption keys, you are part of the club.
There is a very real practical takeaway here for anyone following global security. We have moved past the era where you can look at a map and see a clear line between NATO territory and the rest of the world. The alliance is now defined by its data footprint. Wherever NATO sensors can reach, and wherever their data links can connect, that is effectively the new frontier of Western security. For Israel, this is the ultimate force multiplier. They get to maintain their sovereignty and their unique military identity while benefiting from the largest intelligence gathering machine in human history.
It is a brilliant strategic move for Jerusalem. They have managed to get the benefits of a superpower alliance without the baggage of being a junior partner. But it also means that Israel is now inextricably linked to the stability of NATO. If the alliance fractures internally, or if a future American administration decides to pull back from the Mediterranean, Israel's sensor grid goes dark in a way that would be devastating. They have traded a degree of independence for a massive increase in capability.
That is the gamble. But given the nature of the Iranian threat and the way the world has moved toward these integrated, AI-driven battlefields, I do not think they had much of a choice. You either join the network or you are blinded by it. What I find wild is how little this is being discussed in the mainstream media. They focus on the explosions in the headlines, but they miss the fact that the underlying architecture of global power has been rewired over the last 24 months.
Well, that is why we do this show. To look at the plumbing. And speaking of the plumbing, we should probably talk about what our listeners should be watching for in the coming months. There is a NATO summit coming up in Brussels, and the language they use there is going to be critical. We need to look for phrases like global partner interoperability or enhanced Mediterranean engagement. That is the code for what is actually happening on the ground.
They will also be talking about dual-use infrastructure. Watch for announcements about new satellite constellations or underwater data cables. These are the physical manifestations of the network. If NATO is investing in high bandwidth communication in the Eastern Mediterranean, they are not doing it for better Netflix streaming. They are doing it to support the kind of integrated sorties we just saw. Another thing to watch is the role of the private sector. Companies like Modal, who sponsored this show, are providing the computational power that makes this kind of data processing possible. The line between military hardware and commercial software is blurring.
It is a world where a GPU cluster in Virginia might be just as important to an Israeli strike mission as the fuel in the wings of the jet. It is a total shift in how we think about warfare. The history of NATO started with a bunch of guys in suits in Washington signing a paper to stop Soviet tanks. Today, it is a global, decentralized network of sensors and shooters that is redefining the very concept of a regional conflict. There are no regional conflicts anymore. Everything is networked.
The Iranian regime is learning this the hard way. They thought they could hide behind their proxies and their geographic depth. But when the network decides to find you, there is nowhere to hide. The sorties we saw this week were a message not just to Tehran, but to the world. The West is capable of a level of technical and tactical integration that its adversaries simply cannot match. It is the realization of the peace through strength doctrine in the digital age.
It is also a reminder that alliances are not just about shared values or history. They are about shared reality. If you see the same threats on your screen that I see on mine, we are naturally going to work together to neutralize them. The technology is forcing a level of cooperation that the diplomats could never have achieved on their own. It is a fascinating, if somewhat terrifying, new world.
I think the paradox of NATO expansion is that by trying to protect the periphery, you inevitably invite more conflict. By integrating Israel into this architecture, NATO has effectively made the Iranian border their own frontier. That brings a lot of risk. But the alternative, a fragmented and blind West, is far riskier. We are moving from a world of formal treaties to a world of dynamic networks, and that is going to be the story of the next decade.
It is a lot to process. We have gone from the founding of NATO in 1949 to the cutting-edge sorties over Iran in 2026. It is a clear line of evolution, even if it has been a jagged one. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. This really forced us to look at the big picture of how these pieces fit together. It is not just about the news of the day. It is about the changing nature of power itself.
It really is. And for our listeners, if you want to dive deeper into the technical side of this, I highly recommend going back to episode 1133, where we break down the Caspian Shield and the specific hardware that made that Azerbaijan-Israel-NATO link possible. It provides the perfect technical foundation for everything we discussed today.
Good call. This has been a deep dive into the new global security reality. We have covered the history, the hardware, and the high-stakes geopolitics. I think we have given people a lot to chew on.
I hope so. It is a complex topic, but when you look at the data links and the strategic geography, it all starts to make sense. The Shadow Alliance is finally stepping into the light, and the world will never be the same.
Well, that is a wrap on this one. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and help us process all this data. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who are looking for this kind of deep dive analysis.
Find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and the RSS feed. We will be back soon with another prompt from Daniel.
See you then.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.